I will be talking about the relationship between urban and transport planning and health. I'll particularly focus on the Barcelona Superblock, what it's a new urban model that's being developed in Barcelona. I also introduced the concept of health impact assessment to estimate what are the health impacts of particular urban developments. Barcelona has around 6,000 vehicles per square kilometer, what is some of the highest traffic densities you actually can find in Europe. About 60% of the public space is used by cars, if it's like for driving or for parking. While only about 1 out of 4 trips are actually done by cars. So although the city seems to be very car dominated, the great majority of trips are done actually by walking and by using of public transport. Also, this average speed for cars getting around the city is around 20 kilometers, 22 kilometers per hour, so a fairly low speed. The high traffic density leads to very high levels of air pollution and noise in the city. Also, it leads to insufficient physical activity because when you're in the car, you don't get enough physical activity. And it also leads to urban heat island effects, whereby the temperature in the city is about 4 or 5 degrees higher than surrounding areas. Also, because Barcelona is a very compact city with a lot of public space used for cars, we don't have much green space. And we know that green space is extremely important for physical and mental health. Overall, we know that there is a relationship between how you design a city, how people get around, how this leads to environmental exposures and lifestyle factors, and how this then leads to morbidity or mortality. So if you design a city for cars, for example, you put in a lot of road space for cars and parking, you get high air pollution levels, high noise levels, the heat island effects. You get people that are more stressed because car drivers are normally more stressed. You get less social contacts and less physical activity. This all leads to increased morbidity, cardiovascular disease, mental health problems, and that can lead to premature mortality. On the other side, if you design a city for active transportation, say for cycling, if you put in more cycling paths, secure cycling infrastructure, then people are more likely to cycle, what leads to less air pollution, less noise, less heat island effects because you need less space, less stress, more social contacts, and more physical activity. And it leads to less morbidity and less mortality. So quite a few of these relationships have been established, although there is more research needed. But for our purpose, we use some of this existing information already to try to estimate what are the health impacts of the superblock model in Barcelona. This is Barcelona. Barcelona is a very dense, compact city, originally designed by Ildefons Cerdà to become a very healthy city. Before there was the old city, where people were living very close together, and then he designed the exemplar, the extension, what was done in kind of a grid system with blocks of apartment buildings up to 5-6 high, with green space in the middle of what he envisaged green space in the middle of the blocks, and wide streets for a lot of fresh air. Unfortunately, what happened within the blocks, the space was taken up by something else than green space, like parking and other housing, and the cars were filled with the roads were filled with cars. The superblock model wants to go back to the original idea of Ildefons Cerdà. So at the current, under the current situation, we have a grid system where cars go up, left and right, up and down, a lot of motorized traffic. The idea with the superblock is to cut 4 junctions in the grid system and only allow active transportation in there, like walking and cycling, and also have green space. And so the cars, motorized traffic will be more around it. So here is an example of a superblock, how was it before and after it's been implemented. This is the Sant'Antonio superblock. First, before, what you actually can see is a road with car traffic and a bit of green space. And what they did, they pacified the road, so they don't allow cars to go into anymore, but it's only now open for pedestrians and cyclists. And that's what you can see on the other photo, where we see more green space, no cars anymore, but people walking around. So how can you estimate the health benefits of an urban model like the superblock? For this, we can use health impact assessment. For our particular example, we use the Utopia model. This is a health impact assessment for urban and transport planning. Here you can see the scheme of the different steps that need to be done. On the top, what we would like to collect is the information on what is the exposures we're interested in at the moment, and what will they be with the implementation of the policy, or in this case, the new urban design. For us, for urban and transport planning, we focus on 5 different exposures: air pollution, noise, green space, temperature, and physical activity. So we would like to assess what is the exposure before, and then what are the recommended, and then look at what is the difference between before and after. So for example, for air pollution, if you look at, for example, nitrogen dioxide, you look at what are the current levels of nitrogen dioxide and what are the levels after that, and look what is the difference. Then the next step is to go to the literature and find exposure-response relationships for nitrogen dioxide. So what is the risk of mortality per unit increase in nitrogen dioxide? And you start looking for preferably from systematic review or meta-analysis, where they take a lot of studies together. Then the next step for this is to look at what is the relative risk. So how can you express the unit difference using the exposure response into the relative risk? Because from the relative risk, what we can use that is transfer it into a population attributable risk using a fairly simple algorithm. So the population attributable risk gives an indication of what part of the health effects that we observe is due to this exposure difference. For that, also, we need to have kind of the background health rate, in this case, mortality rate. So we'll find the mortality rate, the current mortality rate, and then try to estimate how many people are likely to die in the city, and how much of that we can attribute to the difference in the exposure before and after. And with this, we get a number of preventable death, what we call, preventable premature mortality, using this. So when we look at Barcelona, for example, what we want to know is, for physical activity, what kind of physical activity there at the moment and what will be there afterwards. So in case for physical activity, we look at transport-related physical activity. So we can see, how many car trips are there before and how many are there being reduced by. In this case, we expect that the superblock model reduces car use by about 90%. So we can then distribute the current car use to other trips. We assume that people take different trips, go for public transport, using the bicycle, using walking, and we provide this input data, and we translate the amount of time they do this new transport into physical activity using metabolic equivalent units. For air pollution, we do the same. In this case, we look at nitrogen dioxide exposure, where before the current situation, we estimate that the exposure around 47 micrograms per meter cube. The superblocks will reduce it to 35 micrograms per meter cube. For noise, we will see that we expect around a 3 decimal reduction in noise levels. And for green space, we see an increase in green space, what we predict with the new Superblock model, where currently there's not much green space, and it will increase because we're introducing more green space there. We think that there probably will be about a threefold increase in green space, going from 6.5% to around 20%. Also, because of the increase in green space, we expect a reduction of the urban heat island effect. So what I said, normally we see that there is about a 4 or 5 degree higher temperature in the center than around it, and probably the super blocks will reduce the temperature by about 1 or 2 degrees. So looking at the exposures, what are currently in Barcelona and what they would be after implementation of the superblocks, we modeled, so what is the difference? And here you can see what we expect, what would happen. If we would implement the superblocks, we expect almost a 20% reduction in car use. We expect around a 25% reduction in nitrogen dioxide, 3 decibel reduction in noise levels, a threefold increase in green space, and also around a 20% reduction in surface temperatures. Then, as what I said, for the health impact assessment, we need exposure response functions, so we can get these from the literature. You can see what is the exposure response functions that we use, particularly for this study. We often, or most of the time, try to get them from meta-analysis, where a number of different studies are being taken together. And so what we're particularly interested is the effect per unit difference in exposure. So if you look for nitrogen dioxide, for example, we see that the relative risk, what is observed for nitrogen dioxide, is 1.04 per 10 microgram per meter cube. That means there's a 4% increase in mortality for each 10 microgram per meter cube nitrogen dioxide exposure. So if you would reduce the exposure of nitrogen dioxide also by 10 microgram per meter cube, you would expect a 4% reduction in mortality. For the others, that applies the same. So then coming to, if we apply this to the superblock model, what we find is that there is almost a 700, that are around 700 deaths that could be avoided if we would implement the superblock in Barcelona. Almost half of them come through a reduction of nitrogen dioxide, the air pollution, followed by noise, by temperature reductions, increase in green space, and at the end, physical activity. The effects of physical activity are underestimated because we don't take into account at the moment physical activity for people just walking around in the block. It's only transport related physical activity. So of course, most of the data is modeled, and ideally we get real data as well when the superblocks are being implemented. So where we actually do the measurements before and after, because most of it relies on modeling, and that's what we're currently doing. But doing the health impact assessment is very important because it can help policymakers base their decisions on actually some numbers, and that's what I like. And it's what I say, introducing the superblocks actually can prevent many deaths. And who is against preventing deaths? So the policymakers have a stronger argument to actually make the changes. When we published the study, we got quite a bit of publicity because it's not only in Barcelona where we look at different urban models, but in many other cities around the world. This model can also be implemented in other cities or in some other form, and many other cities are implementing changes that also are good for health. Also, our Superblock model paper received a lot of attention from blogs, from newspapers, because it's important. We want to improve our cities. We want to make our cities healthier, also more sustainable and more livable. And a new model like the superblocks can well do this.